The bullet whistled past Flora Reyes' face so close she felt the heat of it against her cheek, and she knew in that instant that her 23 years of careful, sheltered existence had just shattered like glass against stone. She threw herself behind the overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs as another shot rang out across the Arizona desert, the sound echoing off the red rock formations that surrounded the narrow mountain pass. Her father lay 10 feet away, his chest still rising and falling but blood seeping through his shirt, and the 3 bandits who had ambushed their small traveling party were closing in with rifles raised and cruel laughter spilling from their mouths. Flora had never fired a gun in her life. Her father, a Boston merchant who had spent the past year establishing a trading post in Agua Caliente, had always insisted his daughter remain refined and proper, a lady in every sense of the word, despite their relocation to the rough Arizona territory. She had learned to embroider and paint watercolors, while other girls her age in this harsh land learned to shoot and ride like men. She had read poetry while they learned survival. And now, crouched behind splintered wood with her father bleeding and their hired escort already dead, she understood exactly how foolish that sheltered upbringing had been. The bandits were speaking in rapid Spanish, their voices growing closer. Flora pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She had never been kissed, never been courted, never even held hands with a man because her father had deemed every suitor in Agua Caliente unworthy of his educated, cultured daughter. She had waited patiently, believing that someday the right man would come along, that her first kiss would be something beautiful and meaningful, not something stolen by violent men in her final terrified moments. Then she heard it, a sound that was barely a sound at all, more like a shift in the very air around her. The bandits heard it too, their laughter cutting off abruptly. One of them shouted something, but his words ended in a strangled gurgle. Flora risked a glance around the edge of the wagon and saw something that seemed impossible in its swift brutality. A man had appeared among the bandits like a force of nature given human form. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, his arms thick with muscle that strained against his buckskin shirt. Dark hair hung past his shoulders, wild and untamed, and his bearded face was set in an expression of cold fury that made Flora's breath catch. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone so large, a hunting knife flashing in his right hand while his left held a tomahawk that gleamed darkly with fresh blood. The second bandit raised his rifle, but the mountain man was faster. He threw the tomahawk with devastating accuracy, and the bandit went down hard. The third man tried to run, but the mountain man caught him in 3 long strides, his knife ending the threat with brutal efficiency. Then there was silence, broken only by the sound of Flora's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The mountain man turned toward her, and Flora found herself staring into eyes the color of a mountain storm, gray and intense and utterly fearless. Blood spattered his face and chest, but he seemed entirely unconcerned. He cleaned his knife on his leather pants, retrieved his tomahawk, and then approached her with surprising gentleness given what she had just witnessed. "You hurt?" His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together, but there was genuine concern in those storm-gray eyes. Flora shook her head, then found her voice. "My father, he is shot. Please, he needs help." The mountain man moved past her to where her father lay. He knelt beside the older man, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the wound. Flora hurried over, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. Up close, she could see the mountain man's face more clearly. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, his features hardened by years in the wilderness, but still handsome beneath the beard and weathered tan. His hands, as he worked to stop her father's bleeding, were calloused and scarred, but moved with practiced precision. "Bullet went clean through," he said without looking up at her. "He has lost a lot of blood, but if we can get him somewhere safe, get this cleaned proper, he might make it. You from Agua Caliente?" "Yes," Flora whispered. "We were returning from Tucson. Our escort, he is dead. I saw. These 3 been working this pass for months. Law has not been able to catch them." He finally looked up at her, and Flora felt something strange flutter in her chest, despite the horror of their situation. "I am Tobias Malone. I got a camp about 2 miles north in the canyon. It is closer than town, and your father will not make the full ride to Agua Caliente. Not in his state. Flora nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as Tobias lifted her father with seemingly no effort at all, cradling the older man against his broad chest. He gestured with his chin toward a massive bay horse that Flora had not even noticed before, standing calm and patient among the rocks. "That is Thunder. He will carry all three of us if you sit careful. Can you ride?" "Not well," Flora admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, another skill she had never properly learned. Tobias's expression did not change. "That is fine. You will ride in front of me. I will keep you steady." He carried her father to the horse with long strides, and Flora followed, her legs still trembling. Tobias secured her father across Thunder's withers with rope that he produced from his saddlebags, then turned to Flora. "Put your foot in the stirrup. I will help you up." His hands encircled her waist, and Flora gasped at the strength in them. He lifted her onto the horse as though she weighed nothing at all, then swung up behind her with fluid ease. His arms came around her to grip the reins, and Flora found herself surrounded by him, his chest solid against her back, his warmth seeping through her dusty traveling dress. She had never been this close to a man before, and the intimacy of it made her face burn despite everything that had just happened. Thunder moved forward at Tobias's command, his gait smooth and careful given his triple burden. Flora gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled fingers, acutely aware of every point where her body touched Tobias's. He smelled of wood smoke and leather and something wild she could not name, and despite the terror still coursing through her veins, she felt something else as well, something warm and unsettling and entirely new. "You did good back there," Tobias said after a few minutes of silence. His breath stirred the hair near her ear, making her shiver. "Kept your head, stayed quiet. That took courage." Flora let out a shaky laugh. "I felt anything but courageous. I felt useless. I do not know how to shoot or defend myself. If you had not come—" Her voice broke. "But I did come." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. "And you are safe now. Your father will be fine. He is strong, I can tell. The wound is bad but not fatal if we work fast." They rode in silence after that, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange and red. Flora had lived in Arizona for a year, but she had never truly appreciated its harsh beauty until this moment, riding through a landscape that could kill as easily as it could take your breath away, held safe in the arms of a man who belonged to this wild land in a way she never would. Tobias's camp was nestled in a narrow canyon where a spring bubbled up from between the rocks, creating a small oasis of green in the red desert. A simple shelter of canvas and wood stood near the water, and Flora could see the remains of a cooking fire, a rack where animal hides hung drying, and various tools and supplies arranged with surprising neatness. It was a temporary camp, she realized, the kind a man made when he intended to move on eventually. Tobias dismounted and lifted Flora down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Then he gently carried her father into the shelter and laid him on a bedroll. "I need you to help me," he said to Flora, already pulling medical supplies from a leather satchel. "Can you do that?" Flora squared her shoulders. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour, she followed Tobias's instructions exactly, helping him clean her father's wound, pack it with herbs she did not recognize, and bandage it tightly. Her father drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning occasionally but mercifully unaware of the worst of the pain. Tobias worked with calm efficiency, his large hands surprisingly skilled at the delicate work of tending injury. When it was done, he sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He should rest now. The fever will come tonight, probably. We will need to keep him cool, get water in him when he can take it. But I have seen men survive worse. Flora looked at her father's pale face, then at Tobias. "Why did you help us? You could have simply ridden past. Those men, they would not have seen you if you had not wanted them to." Tobias was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes steady on her face. "I could not do that." "Why not?" "Because it is not right. Because I have seen too much suffering in this world to walk past when I can help." He stood and moved to the entrance of the shelter, looking out at the darkening sky. "And because I have a sister back in Wyoming, or I did last I heard. If she were in trouble, I would hope some stranger would stop to help her too." Flora rose and moved to stand beside him, though she kept a careful distance. You are far from Wyoming. I am far from a lot of places. There was something in his voice, a note of old pain that made Flora want to ask more, but she sensed he would not welcome the questions. Not yet. Thank you, she said instead. For my father's life. For mine. I do not know how I can ever repay you. Tobias looked down at her and something shifted in his expression, a softness that had not been there before. You do not owe me anything, but you are welcome to stay here as long as your father needs. I have supplies enough for a few days, and the spring has good water. That night, Flora kept watch over her father while Tobias built up the fire and prepared a simple meal of dried meat and beans. The stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead, so many more than she had ever seen in Boston, even more than she usually saw from the relative civilization of Agua Caliente. She ate the food Tobias gave her without tasting it, too exhausted and overwhelmed to register anything beyond the fact that she was still alive, still safe. Her father's fever came just as Tobias had predicted, striking with the full darkness. Flora bathed his forehead with cool water from the spring, while Tobias checked his bandages and got herbal tea down his throat a spoonful at a time. Somewhere near midnight, exhaustion finally overtook Flora. She did not realize she had fallen asleep until she woke with a start to find dawn light filtering through the canyon and her head resting against Tobias's shoulder. She jerked upright, mortified, but Tobias did not seem bothered. He was already awake, she realized, though he must have sat there unmoving for hours to avoid disturbing her rest. Your father's fever broke an hour ago, he said quietly. He is sleeping natural now. Flora looked at her father and saw that it was true. The flush had faded from his cheeks, and his breathing was deep and even. Relief washed over her so strongly that tears sprang to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Tobias stood and stretched, his muscles rippling beneath his shirt. I will make coffee. You should wash at the spring if you want. You will feel better. Flora took his advice, grateful for a few moments alone to collect herself. The spring water was shockingly cold despite the Arizona heat, and she washed her face and hands, trying to scrub away the dust and blood and terror of the previous day. When she returned to the camp, she found Tobias cooking bacon over the fire, coffee already steaming in tin cups. They ate in companionable silence, and Flora found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. Tobias Malone was unlike any man she had ever encountered, so different from the merchants and clerks and would-be miners who had tried to court her in Agua Caliente. He moved with complete confidence in his own strength, wasted no words, and seemed entirely self-sufficient in a way that both impressed and intimidated her. But there was gentleness in him, too. She had seen it in how carefully he tended her father, in how patiently he had helped her onto his horse. How long have you lived out here? She asked, breaking the silence. Tobias took a swallow of coffee before answering. In Arizona, about 3 years. Before that, I was trapping in the Rockies. Before that, other places. I've not had what you would call a permanent home since I was 18 and left my family's farm. Do you miss it? Having a home? He considered this, his gray eyes distant. Sometimes. But I miss the idea of it more than the reality, I think. I was not meant for farming, for staying in one place. My father knew it, though it pained him. He told me once that some men are born to wander, and fighting it only makes them bitter. Flora thought about her own life, the careful structure of it, the rules and expectations that had shaped her every day. I have never wandered anywhere, she admitted. I've barely lived at all, if I'm being honest. My father kept me so sheltered, so protected. Yesterday was the first time I truly understood how dangerous the world could be, how unprepared I am for it. Tobias looked at her. Tobias really looked at her, and Flora felt heat rise in her cheeks. You are stronger than you think. I saw it yesterday. Fear is natural, but you did not let it paralyze you. I did not do anything. You saved us. You stayed calm. You helped me with your father when some women would have fainted or panicked, and you are still here, still thinking, still finding your strength. That counts for something. He paused, then added, Your father meant well, keeping you sheltered. But this land does not forgive ignorance. If you are going to stay in Arizona, you need to learn the skills to survive it. Would you teach me? The words were out before Flora could stop them, and she felt her face flush even hotter. I am sorry. That was presumptuous. You have already done so much." But Tobias was nodding slowly. "I could do that. While we are here, while your father heals, I could teach you some basics. How to shoot, how to start a fire, how to find water. It is not much, but it is better than nothing." Flora felt a smile break across her face, the first real smile since the attack. "I would like that very much." And so began the strangest and most wonderful days of Flora Reyes's life. Her father recovered slowly but steadily, spending most of his time sleeping or talking quietly with Tobias about politics and trade and the changing face of the Arizona territory. Flora, meanwhile, threw herself into learning everything Tobias could teach her, with a hunger that surprised them both. He started with shooting, setting up targets among the rocks and placing his rifle in her hands. The weapon was heavy and intimidating, but Tobias stood behind her, his arms coming around to adjust her grip, his voice patient as he explained about breathing and aim and the kick of the recoil. Flora missed the first dozen shots entirely, her bullets pinging harmlessly off stone, but Tobias never showed frustration. He simply corrected her stance, steadied her hands with his own, and told her to try again. When she finally hit a target, she let out a whoop of triumph that echoed through the canyon, and Tobias's rare smile transformed his entire face. "Good," he said, and the simple word of praise made Flora's heart flutter strangely. He taught her how to build and maintain a fire, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to track animals by their prints and droppings. He showed her how to move quietly through the desert, how to find water by watching the behavior of birds and insects, how to use the sun and stars for navigation. Flora absorbed it all like someone dying of thirst, realizing with each lesson how much of the world she had missed from inside her father's careful protections. But it was not just the practical skills that changed her. It was Tobias himself, the way he moved through the world with such capable confidence, the way he noticed everything around him with those sharp gray eyes. It was the sound of his deep voice in the evening as he told stories of his travels, of grizzly bears in the Rockies and storms on the Great Plains, of encounters with Comanche warriors who had shared their fire and taught him their language. It was the gentle way he checked her father's bandages each morning, the careful way he never touched Flora without permission except when teaching required it. And even then, his hands were always respectful, always proper. Flora found herself thinking about him constantly, even when she should have been focused on other things. She noticed the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the strength in his scarred hands, the rare smile that made her stomach flip. She lay awake at night listening to him move around the camp, keeping watch, always protecting, and felt safer than she ever had in her life. And slowly, gradually, she began to understand that the fluttering in her chest, the warmth that spread through her when he was near, the way her breath caught when their eyes met, all of it meant she was falling in love with Tobias Malone. The realization terrified her. She had never been in love before, had never even been properly courted. And now, here she was losing her heart to a mountain man who lived out of a temporary camp and had no intention of settling down. A man who would surely leave once her father was well enough to travel back to Agua Caliente. A man who had given no indication that he felt anything for her beyond the natural concern one person might feel for another in need. But she could not help it. Every day made it worse, made her feelings stronger and deeper until she ached with them. On the 5th day, Tobias took her hunting. They left her father dozing peacefully in the camp and climbed up into the rocky hills surrounding the canyon. Tobias moved like a ghost, his steps silent despite his size, and Flora tried to copy him, to learn through imitation the grace he made look so effortless. They spotted a small deer near midday, and Tobias handed Flora his rifle. "Take your time," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear as he crouched beside her behind a rock outcropping. "Remember what I taught you. Breathe, aim, squeeze gently." Flora's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to focus. This was not a target. This was a living creature, but it was also meat for their camp, sustenance they needed. She breathed out slowly, aimed just behind the deer's shoulder as Tobias had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the deer dropped. Flora stared in shock at what she had done, and then Tobias's hand was on her shoulder, warm and strong. "Perfect shot. Clean kill. You did well, Flora." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice made something inside her chest crack open. She looked up at him and found him looking back with an expression she had never seen before, something soft and warm that made her breath catch. "Tobias," she whispered, and then she did not know what else to say. He cleared his throat and looked away, but his hand remained on her shoulder a moment longer before he stood. "Come on, I will show you how to field dress it. Not pleasant work, but necessary." He was right that it was not pleasant, but Flora forced herself to watch and learn as Tobias efficiently prepared the deer for transport. His hands were steady and sure, doing what needed to be done without cruelty or waste. "My father taught me to respect the animals we hunt," he said as he worked. "Take only what you need. Use all you can. Thank the creature for its sacrifice. The old tribes understand this better than most white men. We could learn from them." They carried the deer back to camp together, and that night they had fresh venison roasted over the fire. Flora's father was well enough to sit up and eat a proper meal, his color much improved, and he smiled at his daughter with pride when Tobias told him about her successful hunt. "My little girl, bringing home meat like a frontierswoman," he said, his voice still weak but warm with affection. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Flora. I wish she could have seen this." Flora felt tears sting her eyes. Her mother had died when she was 15, taken by fever, and not a day went by that she did not miss her. "I wish she could too, Papa." That night, after her father had fallen asleep, Flora sat by the fire with Tobias, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices eerie and beautiful, and an owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. "Your father is well enough to travel soon," Tobias said quietly. "Another day or two and I can take you both back to Agua Caliente." Flora's heart sank, though she had known this moment was coming. "I suppose you will move on then. Continue your wandering." "That was my plan." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I have a job waiting up in the high country, scouting for a mining operation, good pay, and I've been here long enough. Time to move." "Of course." Flora tried to keep her voice steady, tried not to let him hear the crushing disappointment she felt. "You've been very generous with your time already. We will be forever grateful." Tobias was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. "Flora, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath stop. "These days with you, teaching you, talking with you, they have been—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I've been alone a long time, by choice mostly. I'm not good with people, not comfortable in towns or around crowds. I'm better with animals and trees and silence. But you—" He stopped again, running a hand through his long hair in frustration. "What about me?" Flora whispered. "You make me want things I thought I did not care about anymore. A home, someone to come back to, someone to protect and provide for, not just for a few days, but for always." He stood abruptly and paced away from the fire, his broad shoulders tense. "I should not be telling you this. You are a refined woman, educated, cultured. Your father has plans for you, I'm sure. A proper husband, someone established and respectable, not a wandering mountain man with nothing to his name but a horse and a few skills." Flora stood as well, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. "Tobias, I am 10 years older than you. I have been places and done things that would shock you. I am rough and uneducated, and I do not know the first thing about the kind of life you are used to." He turned back to her, and she could see the conflict warring in his face. "But God help me, Flora, I am falling in love with you. I have been falling since the moment I saw you behind that wagon, brave and scared and beautiful, and I do not know what to do about it." Flora could barely breathe. She crossed the space between them, drawn to him like iron to a lodestone, until she stood just inches away. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the wood smoke and leather scent of him. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said, and saying the words aloud felt like leaping off a cliff. "I have never felt this way before. I have never wanted to feel this way, but I cannot help it, and I do not want to." Tobias made a sound low in his throat, something between a groan and a sigh. His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their size and strength. "You have never even been properly courted. Never been kissed, have you? Flora shook her head, heat flooding her cheeks. My father never permitted it. He said I should wait for the right man, someone worthy. And you think that is me? A drifter with no prospects and no future? I think you are the bravest, strongest, kindest man I have ever met. I think you saved my life and my father's life. I think you have taught me more in 5 days than I learned in 23 years. And I think, she took a shaky breath, I think if you do not kiss me right now, I will die of wanting it. Tobias's eyes darkened, and his thumb brushed across her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. Your first kiss should be special, should be perfect, should be worth the wait you have endured. It will be, Flora whispered, because it will be with you. Tobias bent his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away, but Flora did neither. She rose up on her toes to meet him, her hands clutching at his shirt, and then his lips were on hers, and the world disappeared. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though Tobias was afraid of overwhelming her, but Flora pressed closer, parting her lips instinctively, and Tobias made that low sound again and deepened the kiss. His arms came around her, pulling her against his solid chest, and Flora felt like she was melting, like every nerve in her body had caught fire. She had read about kissing in novels, had heard other women giggle and whisper about it, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. For the way Tobias's mouth moved against hers, teaching her, guiding her, for the strength of his arms holding her safe, for the way her entire body seemed to awaken to something new and wonderful and utterly consuming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. That was worth waiting for, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Flora laughed shakily, her hands still fisted in his shirt. It was worth everything. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the firelight, and Flora felt like her life had just shifted on its axis. Everything was different now. Everything had changed. I do not want you to leave, she said finally. I know you have obligations. I know you are not meant for settling down, but I cannot bear the thought of you walking away. Tobias pulled back enough to look at her face. What are you saying? I'm saying that I love you, Tobias Malone. I'm saying that I want to be with you, wherever that takes us. If you want to keep wandering, then I will learn to wander too. If you want to settle somewhere, then I will help you build a home. I need to be with you, however that looks. Tobias closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with emotion. I do not deserve you, but I want you more than I have ever wanted anything. And the thought of walking away from you, of never seeing you again, I cannot do it, Flora. I cannot. Then do not. She reached up to touch his bearded face, marveling at her own boldness. Stay, or let me come with you. Just do not leave me behind. Your father will want me to be happy, and you make me happy, Tobias. You make me feel alive in a way I never have before. Tobias kissed her again, harder this time, more urgent, and Flora kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of her 23 sheltered years. When they broke apart, both of them were trembling. We will talk to your father tomorrow, Tobias said, his arms still tight around her. Tell him how we feel. Ask for his blessing if he will give it, and then we will figure out the rest together. Is that acceptable? Flora nodded against his chest, happier than she had ever been in her life. That is more than acceptable. That is perfect. They stayed by the fire long into the night, holding each other, stealing kisses, making whispered plans for a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. Flora finally understood what all those romance novels had been trying to describe, the feeling of completeness that came from finding the right person, the sense that everything had led to this moment, this man, this love. When they finally separated to sleep, Flora lay on her bedroll next to her father and stared up at the stars, touching her lips where Tobias had kissed them. Her first kiss. And it had been worth every year of waiting, every moment of wondering if it would ever happen. Because it had been with Tobias, and that made it perfect. The next morning, Flora woke to find her father sitting up and looking much stronger, his eyes clear and focused. Tobias was already up, making coffee and preparing breakfast, and when his eyes met Flora's across the fire, the warmth in them made her blush. After they had eaten, Tobias cleared his throat. Mr. Reyes, I need to speak with you about something important." Flora's father looked between them, and something knowing crossed his face. "I wondered when this was coming. You think an old man does not notice the way his daughter looks at a man, or the way that man looks back?" Flora felt her face flame, but Tobias did not look away. "Sir, I know I am not what you would have chosen for Flora. I have no property, no business, no prospects that would appeal to a father wanting security for his daughter. But I love her, and I believe she loves me, and I'm asking for your blessing to court her properly, with the intention of marriage if she will have me." Mr. Reyes was quiet for a long moment, studying Tobias with sharp eyes. "You saved our lives. You have shown nothing but honor and respect toward my daughter, even though we have been alone out here with no one to see or judge. That speaks well of your character. Mr. Malone." "Tobias, sir, please." "Tobias, then." Mr. Reyes looked at Flora. "Is this what you want, daughter? Truly? Because life with a man like this will not be easy. It will not be the comfortable, cultured life I wanted for you." Flora moved to sit beside her father, taking his hand. "Papa, you wanted me to wait for the right man, someone worthy, and I have found him. Tobias is brave and strong and kind. He makes me want to be stronger, braver, better. He makes me feel alive. And yes, I love him. More than I thought it was possible to love someone." Her father's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "You have grown up so much in these few days. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become." He looked back at Tobias. "I give you my blessing, with one condition." "Name it," Tobias said immediately. "You marry her properly, in a church with witnesses. I will not have anyone questioning her honor or yours. And you provide for her to the best of your ability, whatever that looks like. Can you promise me that?" Tobias nodded, his expression solemn. "You have my word, sir. On both counts." Mr. Reyes held out his hand and Tobias shook it firmly. Then the older man pulled Flora into a gentle embrace. "Be happy, my girl. That is all I have ever wanted for you." Flora hugged her father tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I will be, Papa, I promise." 2 days later, when Mr. Reyes was strong enough to ride, they made the journey back to Agua Caliente. Tobias fashioned a travois for Thunder to pull, allowing Mr. Reyes to rest comfortably during the trip, and they traveled slowly, stopping often. Flora rode behind Tobias, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his broad back, and thought she had never been so content. Agua Caliente was a small town, barely more than a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a natural hot spring that gave the settlement its name. Mr. Reyes's trading post stood at one end of the main street, a solid structure that served as both business and home. The townspeople came out to greet them, shocked by the story of the bandit attack and full of praise for Tobias's rescue. The local priest, Father Miguel, was summoned immediately. He was a rotund man with kind eyes and a booming laugh, and he listened to their story with growing amazement. "A true hero," he declared, clapping Tobias on the shoulder hard enough to stagger a smaller man. "God sent you to save this family, no doubt about it." Tobias looked uncomfortable with the praise, but he accepted it with grace. When Mr. Reyes explained that they wanted a wedding, Father Miguel's face lit up. "A wedding? How wonderful! When would you like this to happen?" Tobias looked at Flora. "As soon as possible, if that is acceptable to you." Flora nodded, her heart soaring. "Yes, as soon as possible." Father Miguel consulted his calendar. "Today is Thursday. If we post the banns immediately and waive the traditional waiting period given the circumstances, we could perform the ceremony on Sunday. That gives us 3 days to prepare. Will that work?" It was fast, faster than Flora had ever imagined, but she found she did not care. Why wait when she knew exactly what she wanted? "That would be perfect," she said, squeezing Tobias's hand. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The women of Agua Caliente rallied around Flora, altering a dress that had belonged to the mayor's late wife, a beautiful cream-colored gown with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Flora tried to help her father in the trading post, but he shooed her away, telling her to focus on her wedding preparations. Tobias, meanwhile, made arrangements for their future with characteristic efficiency. He sold his services as a scout and guide to a merchant caravan that regularly traveled between Agua Caliente and Tucson, a job that would keep him close to home, but still allow him to use his wilderness skills. He purchased a small plot of land just outside town, on a rise with a good view and access to water, and began making plans to build a house there. He even visited the barber and had his hair and beard trimmed, though Flora privately thought he looked just as handsome before. On Saturday evening, the night before the wedding, Flora's father held a small dinner at the trading post for close friends and neighbors. Tobias arrived wearing new clothes, dark trousers, and a crisp white shirt that showed off his powerful build, and Flora could barely take her eyes off him. He looked uncomfortable in the formal wear, kept tugging at the collar, but he smiled when he saw her and everything else faded away. After dinner, Tobias asked if he could speak with Flora privately. They stepped out onto the porch behind the trading post, where the setting sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rose. Tobias took both her hands in his expression serious. "I do not have much to give you," he said. "Not yet, anyway. But I wanted you to have something for tomorrow, something that belonged to my mother." He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and tipped its contents into her palm. A ring fell out, simple gold with a small turquoise stone set in the center. It is not fancy, but it was precious to her. And my father gave it to me before I left home, said I should give it to a woman I loved if I ever found one. I think my mother would be happy to know you are wearing it. Flora's eyes filled with tears. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, the turquoise a perfect match for the Arizona sky. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Thank you, Tobias. I will treasure it always." He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her gently, mindful that they were not yet married and her father was just inside. "Tomorrow you will be my wife," he said against her hair. "I still cannot quite believe it." "Neither can I," Flora admitted. "A month ago I was afraid I would never be kissed, never fall in love, never find someone who understood me. And now here I am, marrying the most wonderful man I have ever met." "I am not wonderful," Tobias protested. "I am rough and wild and—" Flora silenced him with a kiss. "You are wonderful to me. That is what matters." They stood together on the porch until full darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, and Flora thought about how much her life had changed since that terrifying day in the mountain pass. She had learned to shoot and hunt and survive in the wilderness. She had found courage she did not know she possessed. And most importantly, she had found Tobias, a man who saw her not as something fragile to be protected, but as someone strong enough to stand beside him. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the September heat already building by mid-morning. The church was small but beautifully maintained, its whitewashed walls cool and quiet. Flora arrived with her father, wearing the borrowed dress and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that the mayor's wife had picked that morning. Her hands were shaking as her father led her up the aisle, but when she saw Tobias waiting at the altar, strong and solid, and looking at her with such love in his gray eyes, all her nervousness melted away. Father Miguel performed the ceremony in a mixture of Spanish and English, his voice warm and filled with joy. Flora barely heard the words, too focused on Tobias's face, on the way his hands gripped hers, on the wonder in his expression as they exchanged vows. When Father Miguel finally pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias cupped her face in his large hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Flora felt tears spill down her cheeks. The congregation burst into applause, and then they were walking back down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs. Tobias Malone, and Flora's heart felt so full she thought it might burst. The townspeople had organized a celebration in the town square with food and music and dancing that went on into the evening. Flora danced with her father, with Father Miguel, with half the men in town, but mostly she danced with Tobias, who moved with surprising grace for such a large man. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Tobias leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Malone?" Flora nodded, her stomach fluttering with anticipation and nervousness. Tobias had rented a room at the town's small boarding house for their wedding night, and tomorrow they would begin building their future together. But tonight was just for them. They slipped away from the party hand in hand and walked through the quiet streets to the boarding house. Mrs. Chen, the proprietor, greeted them with a knowing smile and showed them to a room at the end of the hall. It was simply furnished but clean, with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt and windows that looked out over the desert. Once they were alone, Flora felt suddenly shy. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands twisting together, acutely aware that she had no idea what came next. Tobias must have sensed her nervousness because he crossed to her and pulled her gently into his arms. "We do not have to rush anything," he said softly, his lips brushing her temple. "We have the rest of our lives, Flora. Tonight can be as slow or as simple as you need it to be." Flora looked up at him, at this man who had become her whole world in such a short time. "I'm not scared," she said, and realized it was true. "I trust you, Tobias, completely." He kissed her then, deep and slow, and Flora melted against him. His hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress, and she helped him, suddenly eager to feel his skin against hers. The dress pooled at her feet, followed by her chemise and petticoats, until she stood before him in nothing but the turquoise ring on her finger. Tobias looked at her like she was something precious and miraculous, and Flora felt beautiful under his gaze. She reached for his shirt, fumbling with the buttons, and he helped her pull it over his head. His chest was broad and muscled, covered in old scars that told stories of his dangerous life, and Flora traced them with wondering fingers. They came together on the bed, and Tobias was patient and gentle, teaching her this new intimacy with the same care he had used to teach her to shoot and track. And when they finally joined, when Flora cried out at the brief pain followed by waves of pleasure unlike anything she had ever imagined, Tobias held her close and whispered words of love against her skin. Later, lying wrapped in his arms with the moonlight streaming through the windows, Flora felt more complete than she had ever thought possible. "I love you," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his scarred shoulder. "I love you too," Tobias rumbled, his hand stroking through her unbound hair. "My brave, beautiful wife." Flora smiled against his skin and let herself drift towards sleep, safe and loved and home at last. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Flora's life. True to his word, Tobias began building their house on the land he had purchased, and Flora helped as much as she could, learning about construction and planning and all the practical aspects of creating a home. Her father, now fully recovered, contributed both advice and materials from the trading post, clearly pleased to see his daughter so happy. The house took shape slowly, built of adobe brick in the traditional style with a covered porch that would provide shade from the brutal summer heat. It was not large, just 4 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and filled with their hopes for the future. Tobias worked mostly in the early mornings and evenings, spending the hot midday hours guiding merchant caravans through the surrounding wilderness. Flora used her newfound skills to contribute as well, hunting small game to supplement their meals and tending a small garden near the house site. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Tobias taught Flora more wilderness skills, taking her on overnight camping trips where she learned to survive with minimal supplies. Flora, in turn, taught him to read and write beyond the basics he had picked up as a child, patiently working through books with him in the evenings until he could manage simple letters and documents on his own. "Never thought I would have use for this," he admitted one evening, laboriously writing his name at the bottom of a practice page. "But I like that we can write to each other now, if we are ever apart." Flora leaned over to kiss his cheek. "You are a good student, better than you give yourself credit for." By November, the house was finished enough to move into, and they spent their first night in their own home, wrapped in blankets before a crackling fire, too excited to sleep. Flora looked around at the sturdy walls that would shelter them, at the furniture Tobias had built with his own hands, at the hooks where his rifle and her new one hung side by side, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. With this man, in this wild land, building a life from nothing but love and determination. Winter came to the Arizona desert, bringing cold nights and occasional snow in the higher elevations. Flora learned to appreciate the changing seasons, so different from the muted transitions of Boston. She and Tobias spent the quiet evenings talking about their future, about the children they hoped to have, about growing old together in the house they had built. In February, Flora realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. She told Tobias on a warm evening when they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. "You are sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Flora nodded, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. I'm sure. Are you happy? Tobias pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. Happy? Flora, I am... His voice broke and she felt wetness on her hair and realized he was crying. I never thought I would have this, a home, a wife, a child. I thought I would die alone out in the wilderness somewhere. But you gave me everything. Everything. They held each other as the sun sank below the horizon, and Flora felt tears of joy streaming down her own face. I love you so much, she whispered. You changed my life, Tobias. You showed me what it means to truly live. The months of her pregnancy passed peacefully. Flora's father was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, and the women of Agua Caliente rallied around her with advice and knitted baby clothes and endless stories of their own children. Tobias became even more protective than usual, worrying constantly about Flora overexerting herself, though she felt healthier and stronger than ever. In late September, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding, Flora went into labor. The midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Martinez, attended her while Tobias paced outside like a caged animal, unable to sit still or focus on anything beyond what was happening behind the closed door. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next morning, and there were moments when Flora thought she could not bear another contraction. But she remembered the strength Tobias had seen in her from the very beginning, remembered that she had survived bandit attacks and learned to shoot and built a home in the desert, and she found the will to push through. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon, Flora felt the baby slip free with a final burning rush. Menis. Martinez's triumphant cry filled the room. It is a boy, a healthy, strong boy. Flora collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but elated, and then Mrs. Martinez was placing the baby in her arms. He was red and wrinkled and screaming with impressive volume, and Flora thought he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The door burst open, and Tobias rushed in, his face wild with worry until he saw Flora and the baby. Then, his expression transformed into something so tender it made Flora's heart ache. He crossed to the bed in 2 long strides and knelt beside it, staring at his son with wonder. He is perfect, he breathed, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger. Flora, you did so well. You are so strong. I'm so proud of you. Flora smiled tiredly at him. Do you want to hold your son? Tobias looked terrified at the prospect, but he nodded and carefully took the baby from her arms. The infant looked impossibly small in his large hands, but Tobias held him with surprising confidence, cradling him against his broad chest. Hello, little one, he murmured. I am your father, and I promise I will keep you safe and teach you everything I know and love you every day of your life. Flora watched her husband with their newborn son and felt such overwhelming love she thought her heart would burst. What should we name him? She asked softly. Tobias looked at her, his gray eyes bright with tears. I was thinking Thomas after your father, Thomas Mitchell Malone. What do you think? Flora's eyes filled. Papa would be so honored. I think it is perfect. They named their son Thomas, and he grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. Flora's father doted on his grandson, teaching him numbers and letters from an early age, while Tobias took him on gentle explorations of the desert, pointing out tracks and plants and teaching him to move quietly like the animals they observed. Flora bloomed into motherhood with the same determination she had brought to learning wilderness skills. She proved to be a patient, loving mother while still maintaining her own interests and skills. She continued to hunt and shoot, often with baby Thomas strapped to her back in a cradle board Tobias had made, copying designs from the Apache women who sometimes came to trade in town. When Thomas was 2 years old, Flora found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and in the spring she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Tobias's mother. Margaret had her father's build, sturdy and strong even as an infant, and his serious expression, but she also had a fierce independence that reminded Flora of herself. The years flowed past like water, each season bringing its own rhythms and joys. Their little house on the rise expanded as Tobias added more rooms to accommodate their growing family. Flora gave birth to 2 more children over the next 6 years, another son named Henry, and finally another daughter, Sophia. 4 healthy children, each one loved fiercely by both parents, each one growing up learning to navigate both the cultured world their grandfather represented and the wild freedom their father embraced. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who could track a cougar through rocky terrain and also quote Shakespeare from memory. Margaret became an expert markswoman who also played piano beautifully on the instrument her grandfather had imported at great expense. Henry had his father's wanderlust, but also his mother's love of learning. And Sophia, the baby, charmed everyone with her quick smile and quicker mind. Flora's father remained a constant presence in their lives until he passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night when Thomas was 12. They buried him in the town cemetery with half of Agua Caliente in attendance, and Flora grieved deeply for the man who had protected her for so long and then blessed her to fly free. Tobias held her through those dark days, steady as always, reminding her that her father had lived to see his grandchildren and know that his daughter was happy and safe. The trading post passed to Flora, and she ran it with the same determination she brought to everything else, turning it into the most successful business in town. Tobias continued guiding caravans and hunting when needed, his reputation growing until people came from as far as Tucson specifically to hire him. But he always came home to Flora, to their children, to the house they had built together. As the years passed and their children grew into adults with lives of their own, Flora and Tobias found themselves alone again, their home suddenly quiet after decades of noise and chaos. Thomas joined his father as a wilderness guide, often taking his own clients, while Tobias began to slow down, his knees bothering him more with each passing year. Margaret married a rancher and moved to a property north of town, while Henry set out to explore California, writing long letters home about the wonders he found there. Sophia stayed close, helping her mother run the trading post and caring for her aging parents with gentle patience. On a warm evening in their 35th year of marriage, Flora and Tobias sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the desert they both loved. Tobias's hair had gone completely gray, and his beard was white as snow, but his eyes were still that same storm gray that had captivated Flora so many years ago. Flora's own dark hair was streaked with silver, and her hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but she felt no regret for the life she had chosen. "Do you ever regret it?" Tobias asked suddenly, his rough hand finding hers. "Marrying me instead of some respectable merchant? Having such a hard life out here?" Flora turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then shown her how to truly live it. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. Adventure and love and a family and a home that we built with our own hands. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Tobias raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture he had performed thousands of times over their decades together, but which still made her heart flutter. "I love you, Flora Malone. More now than on the day we met, if that is even possible." "It is possible," Flora said, leaning against his shoulder, "because I feel the same way. You were my first kiss, my first love, my only love, and it was worth every moment of waiting." They sat together as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss so many years ago. And Flora thought about the terrified young woman she had been, sheltered and unprepared for the harsh realities of the world. That woman was gone, transformed by love and hardship and joy into someone strong and capable and deeply content. She had learned to shoot and hunt and survive in the wilderness. She had built a business and raised 4 children and created a life that would have seemed impossible back when she was that sheltered merchant's daughter. But most importantly, she had learned to love and be loved by a man who saw her as an equal partner, someone to stand beside rather than behind. Tobias's arm came around her shoulders, and Flora smiled into the darkness. Her first kiss had been worth the wait because it had come from him. Their life together had been worth every struggle and sacrifice because they had faced it all together. And now, in the golden years of their marriage, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the home they had built, Flora knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought them here. The desert wind whispered through the darkness, carrying the scent of sage and juniper, and Flora closed her eyes and let herself rest in the arms of the mountain man who had shown her what it meant to be truly, completely, wonderfully alive. Their story had started with violence and fear, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the transforming power of love and the strength that comes from facing life's challenges together. In the years that followed, Flora and Tobias aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing season. They became fixtures in Agua Caliente, respected elders whose story had become the stuff of local legend. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Flora would smile and tell them that the secret to a good marriage was simple: find someone who makes you want to be braver, stronger, better than you ever thought possible. Find someone who sees your potential even when you cannot see it yourself. Find someone who will stand beside you through every trial and triumph, and then hold on to them with everything you have. Tobias would add, in his gruff way, that it also helped to have a wife who could shoot straight and was not afraid of hard work, which always made Flora laugh and swat his arm affectionately. They were blessed with 11 grandchildren and eventually even a few great-grandchildren, and their small house on the rise became a gathering place for family celebrations and quiet Sunday dinners. Flora taught her granddaughters to shoot and her grandsons to read, refusing to accept that certain skills belonged only to one gender or the other. Tobias took all of them on camping trips into the wilderness, passing on his knowledge of the land to a new generation that would need those skills in an increasingly civilized world. In their 53rd year of marriage, as winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the desert, Tobias fell ill with pneumonia. Flora nursed him with fierce determination, refusing to let him slip away, and for weeks it seemed it would go either way. But Tobias was strong, his body hardened by decades of outdoor life, and slowly he began to recover. The illness left him weaker than before, though, and he finally agreed to let Thomas take over most of his guiding work. "I am getting old," he admitted to Flora one evening, the words clearly difficult for him to say. "I never thought I would live this long, honestly, but I am not ready to leave you yet. I have more years in me still." "Good," Flora said firmly, taking his hand. "Because I am not finished with you yet, Tobias Malone. We have at least another 20 years together, and I will not hear otherwise." He smiled at her, that rare transforming smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Whatever you say, my love. You have always been the strong one between us anyway." Flora laughed at that. "That is absolutely not true. But we are stronger together than either of us could ever be apart. That has always been our secret." They did get those additional years, though not quite 20. In their 59th year of marriage, as Flora was approaching 82 and Tobias had just turned 92, he passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand clasped in Flora's. She woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find him gone, and though her heart broke at the loss, she also felt profound gratitude for the nearly 6 decades they had been given together. They buried Tobias on the land where their house stood, under a juniper tree he had always loved, with a simple marker that read, "Tobias Mitchell Malone, beloved husband, father, and friend. He taught us all to be brave." Flora lived for 3 more years after Tobias's death, still sharp-minded and capable despite her age. She ran the trading post until the very end, took meals with her children and grandchildren, and spent her evenings sitting on the porch of the house she and Tobias had built, remembering. She spoke often of him, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had never known the wild, untamed mountain man he had been in his youth. On a warm September evening, almost exactly 62 years after that fateful day when bandits had attacked and a stranger had saved her life, Flora passed quietly in her sleep. Her children found her the next morning sitting in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, a peaceful smile on her face, as though she had simply decided it was time to go find Tobias. They buried her beside him under the juniper tree, and the entire town of Agua Caliente turned out for the funeral. The marker they placed beside Tobias's read, "Flora Rose Malone, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She learned to soar." Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to live in and around Agua Caliente, carrying forward the legacy of courage and love and partnership that Flora and Tobias had built. The house on the rise stood for another century, a testament to what could be built when 2 people committed themselves fully to each other and to their shared life. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the juniper trees, people swore they could see two figures sitting on that old porch, holding hands and watching the sunset together, still in love after all these years, their story complete but never truly ending. Because love like that, love built on respect and partnership and unwavering commitment, never really dies. It lives on in the people it touched, in the family it created, in the example it set for generations to come. Flora had been 23 years old and had never been kissed when a mountain man named Tobias Malone saved her life. He had made sure her first kiss was worth the wait she had endured, and then he had given her 62 years of love and adventure and partnership that exceeded anything she could have dreamed of in her sheltered youth. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, proof that the right person at the right time can transform everything, can turn a frightened young woman into a pioneer and a wandering mountain man into a devoted husband and father. Their story was one that Agua Caliente told and retold for generations, a reminder that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that strength came in many forms, and that a life lived with courage and commitment was the greatest adventure of all. And at the heart of it all was that first kiss, given and received with tenderness and promise under the desert stars, the perfect beginning to a love story that would span nearly a lifetime and touch countless others along the way. The end was not sad because it was an ending, but joyful because it was a completion. Flora and Tobias had lived fully, loved deeply, and created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. They had faced every challenge together, celebrated every triumph together, and in the end, they had died, as they had lived side by side, partners to the very end and beyond. And if you had asked Flora, in those final moments before she closed her eyes for the last time, if she had any regrets, she would have smiled and said no, because she had been kissed by the right man, had loved the right man, had built a life with the right man. And that made everything, every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear or doubt completely and utterly worth it. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind carried the scent of sage and juniper past the house on the rise where two people had loved each other for a lifetime. Their story was complete, their love immortal, their legacy secure in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched. And that was the best ending any love story could hope for.